I am so honored to introduce to many of you Mrs. Sonya Robertson. Sonya was diagnosed with cancer 28 years ago at the age of 20. And accompanied by a close friend when receiving the news, Sonya found herself comforting her friend who was struggling to reconcile the diagnosis. At the time of her cancer diagnosis, Sonya had just started a full-time job and was forced to consider delaying potentially life-saving surgery to ensure there was enough income to house and feed her 4-year-old daughter, of whom she was the only active parent. After exploring her options of delaying surgery or facing an extended period of leave without pay, at the onset of her new employment, Sonya decided to proceed with the surgery and delay dealing with the anticipated financial fallout. God proved faithful. Sonya recommitted her life to Christ in 1999 and has served in various roles throughout the body of Christ. Sonya lives in Indianapolis, Indiana, and attends the Caring Place Church with her husband, Bryant. Sonya graduated from Indiana University with a master's degree in public management and has served as a human resources specialist in federal government for 14 years. She is joining us today to help us understand the federal protections provided to people suffering from chronic illness and policies and programs that may be useful as you navigate living chronic faith in your workplace. With that, I am pleased to present to you Ms. Sonya Robertson.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm super excited to be with you today. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that we can talk about some of the things that are available to people who are living chronic faith in their workplace. And some of these policies that I talk about, some of them are federal, actually all of them are federal. And I try to differentiate those that are specific to federal government versus those that are requirements for all organizations. So welcome to Living Chronic Faith in Your Workplace. So there are federal laws that prohibit discrimination, and there are particular programs that actually advocate for people with disabilities and people that are struggling with chronic illness to be more inclusive. Like, they're challenging employers to be more inclusive in their policies when it comes to the working environment. So I want you to know that there are federal laws and programs that are on your side to help keep you working if that's what you choose to do as you're navigating chronic faith. So today it's going to be a very active discussion, so I hope you're ready to kind of talk with me a little bit about some of these laws. We're going to talk about what are the laws that are protecting you from discrimination and harassment in the workplace. We're going to talk about reasonable accommodation. I'm going to tell you that word will frighten about every employer, but I want you to know what reasonable accommodation is and how you can use that terminology and those words and the program to your advantage as you continue to work as navigating your chronic faith. We're going to talk about different flexibilities and maybe even some cool resources that you could use. We're going to talk about the process for reasonable accommodation. And the reason why I think it's important that we talk about the process is because it is a policy that most employers know little about. So you may become the person educating the people you are counting on knowing this information. But I want to equip you with the information that you need to be able to assist even the most educated of employers on reasonable accommodation, and to be able to assist those who may not know a lot about it. You may be the guiding light for them. We're going to talk about understanding what your supervisor can and can't ask you when it comes to your medical information, and then talk about your rights under FMLA. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's the amended act, so they amended it, and are also referred to as the ADAAA. Now, this is interesting to know that when the American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, came out, what happened was it was being interpreted very narrowly. And because the courts and the judges did not appreciate how employers were interpreting the law, and even court cases, what they did was they amended the act to make sure that it was all inclusive. I'm gonna be honest with you, probably almost most of America, 70% or more, and I made that number up, probably would qualify for some type of provision under the ADAAA. And this is, again, remember, the purpose and the spirit behind the ADAAA was that we can make our working environments more inclusive for those who are navigating either disabilities or chronic illness in the workplace. We know that the governing body when it comes to the ADAAA is the EEO, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And you'll see that website, because if you have any complaints of an employer who is violating the ADAAA, then you would file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So then what is a disability? We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act Amended Act, or the ADAAA. So what's a disability as defined? Well, a disability as defined by the EEOC is a physical or mental condition that limits a major life activity. It's just that simple. So any major life activity, so if you have a physical or mental condition that impacts how you walk, talk, how you see, how you hear or learn. It even includes internal bodily functions. If you have a physical or mental impairment that impedes some type of bodily function, then you've qualified as a person with disability, and you qualify for the protections under the ADAAA. So there's another thing. So if a person has a disability or a history of a disability. So in my case, I had cancer. The cancer is now, praise the Lord, in remission. I would still qualify, because at any point that it could reemerge. And so I would qualify under the ADAAA. So just know that they have amended the act to make sure that we are being a workforce that is inclusive of people who may struggle with those who are not suffering from these same chronic illnesses or disabilities. So the Americans with Disabilities Act Amended Act, it is a law that forbids discrimination. I have to move my screen. Sorry. It forbids discrimination when it comes to any aspect of employment. That means the hiring, the firing, they can't discriminate against you when it comes to pay. Any job assignments, they can't discriminate. Promotions, layoff, training. So for instance, if you have an employer who maybe you need additional assistance walking, or there's specific accommodations that you need to be able to be viable in the workplace, what they can't do is send someone to training for your position and bring the information back to you. You should have equal access to attend training as well, even if they have to make special provisions for you to do so. So you should not be discriminated against in any part of employment. You should be able to participate as someone who did not have a disability. And so that's the point of the ADAAA, and that's the spirit of the law. The law requires an employer to provide, here's that word, reasonable accommodations to employees and job applicants with a disability. And so what that means is, if there is a reasonable accommodation that can be made for you to interview for a job, then they need to make it. So if right now we're in COVID-19, if you're particularly susceptible to illness due to this pandemic, and they want to interview you in person, but it's more safe for you to be interviewed virtually, then they should make that provision for you, as long as you provide them with the information, letting them know that you are covered under the ADAAA. And of course, if you experience any type of discrimination, whether it be harassment or denied a promotion, an opportunity to interview, or training, or any fringe benefit that someone without a disability gets to participate in, then you should always consider contacting the EEOC, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and there is their website available, eeoc.gov. So let's just stop here for a minute and Allison, I'm not sure if we can unmute or if we have a chat box that we might be able to use, but I want to make sure as we go through this presentation that you're capturing the important information. So I want to test your knowledge right here and ask you, who do you contact if you believe you're experiencing harassing or discriminatory behaviors in the workplace? Is it A, you better call Tyrone? Is it B, I tell my medical provider? Is it C, I file a complaint with EEOC? Or D, no one, I just quit and find another job? Awesome. C, you're absolutely right.
Excellent.
Yes,
So we're using kind of a combination of the chat and voice, if that's okay.
that is definitely okay. Allison, if you can help me moderate the chat box, that would be wonderful because I can't really see it from when I share my screen. Is that okay? Nice, excellent work. You want to make sure that if you find that you're experiencing, or if you even think that you're experiencing harassing behaviors, that you make sure that you talk to someone who can do something about it. And that's the EEOC, who's the governing body over the ADAAA. So we talked about the word reasonable accommodation. What is a reasonable accommodation? I'm going to tell you that a lot of employers, my experience has been, when you say this word, they begin to shake because they know it's out there and that it exists, but a lot of times they don't have a lot of information about it. And so I want to equip you and empower you with information so that you can help lead the discussion, whether they have extensive knowledge on the subject or they don't, that you can lead that conversation effectively. So a reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment to help a person with a disability actually be able to do the job. So apply for employment or complete the duties that they are assigned. So the change can be as small as, hey, you know, maybe I'm wheelchair bound. So therefore, when you're asking me to file things for people who haven't given up paper yet, you're asking me to file things in the 6-foot filing cabinet, I can't reach that. But I can file things from the waist level down. So maybe they would try to make a modification where maybe M through Z is waist level down, and you're responsible for filing M through Z, and maybe someone else who maybe is not bound by a wheelchair can file A through P. So it's just those simple, it can be that simple. Like, hey, I know I'm supposed to be filing. Here's my limitation. Here's how you can help me be able to still do the work that I'm required to do, but do it within the capacity and safely so that nobody's hurt or injured in the process. And so it's really just working with your employer to identify those duties that are difficult for you to perform, and being able to talk with your employer about accommodations that they can make that will help you be able to perform them. Now, granted, they shouldn't take, if filing is part of your duties, they shouldn't take it from you altogether. You still have viable contributions you can make. I just can't file a 6-foot filing cabinet. I can't file up there. So they should be able to continue to allow you to do your filing duties with just a small modification. That's a reasonable accommodation. Sometimes reasonable accommodations are quite lofty. So that may include, if we're talking about someone that's wheelchair bound, it may include building a ramp to a building that didn't previously have one. So that reasonable accommodation can help with that conversation. Another accommodation that can be made is something simple. Hey, I have these acute issues that some days I'm, high emotion, high spirited, easily little physical limitations. And there's other days where I wake and, oh my goodness, I can barely move. It's everything just to get out of the bed. And so maybe the accommodation is leave. That when you wake up and you're like, oh, it's one of those days, that maybe they give you a flexible leave schedule so that you can use leave, maybe come in a little bit later give me some time to loosen up these muscles. If you notice that your condition allows you maybe later in the day to move a little bit easier. So we can talk about modified schedules. We can talk about flexible leave schedules. These are two reasonable accommodations that can be afforded to you in the workplace and should, according to the ADAAA. So the reasonable accommodations can be something big and major, or it can be very small things. It's whatever you need to be able to positively contribute in your workplace, and not take anything from you that you can do, just modify it so that you can do it just like a person that does not have a limitation or a disability. So let's go back to test your knowledge. And as Allison said, she's going to moderate the chat box for me. Our next question is name one accommodation and type your answer in the chat box. Now I've cheated a little bit in the fact that there is a website that you should be aware of. It's called askjan.org. And Allison is going to share with us what this website looks like. Allison, do you mind pulling up the AskJan, or do I need to stop sharing first?
Yes, I'll need you to stop sharing and then I'll start sharing.
Okay. So AskJan is a very important website. What I love about AskJan are these are professionals, these are scholars, these are people that are in social work, that are have doctoral degrees, master's degrees, that are specifically have contributed to this website with information that will be useful for anyone who is living chronic faith in their workplace. So if you look on the AskJan website, you can look up disabilities by accommodations, or different accommodations for different disabilities. So Allison, if you don't mind, yeah, the accommodation search. So I can go look at the A through Z list. You mind clicking on the A through Z list? If you've never seen this website, I encourage you to go play. And then if you scroll down a little bit, Miss Allison, you see all of these different conditions that are listed. And Allison, can you pick a condition just out of the blue? So if you have been diagnosed, is that Raynaud's disease?
Raynaud's. Mm-hmm.
Raynaud's, okay, thank you. If you've been diagnosed with Raynaud's disease, do you see that there's a plethora of information that's already available to you on this page to help educate your employer about what life might be like for you? Somebody else has already put it in writing. These are some things that you may be experiencing because with this diagnosis. But what I love about it, it doesn't just educate the employer about the disease, but it also starts talking about ways that you can start the conversation with accommodation ideas. How might I be able to accommodate someone with Raynaud's disease? And this information, as you can see, the questions 1 through 7, it tells you about maybe some of the limitations. I love it. Thank you, Allison, for stopping right there. Some of the limitations that you might be experiencing. Now, we know that we're all different. And so everyone doesn't experience the same limitations. But this is when the reasonable accommodation conversation comes into play. It's so important, is that you explain to your employer which limitations you experience. So if you have all of them, then hey, click on all of them and let's start a conversation one by one, how we're going to accommodate these limitations. So in one way, if I know that, can you scroll back to the accommodation? I like that better. Thank you, Allison. So if you see that I'm feeling or sensing, or I have a trouble grasping things and you want me, we're back to the filing, you want me to file things, understand that it's hard for me to grasp things some days. And so then the question becomes, what can we do to assist with that when you're struggling with grasping things? Is there something that we can do? And so if you start listing or looking on this website, it'll be able to show you the different accommodation ideas that are available. And as long as they're reasonable, then your employer should comply. Now, there are some restrictions on that we'll talk about later. Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing your screen so that we could see the AskJan website.
Thank you.
Uh-oh, there we go. So if you don't mind, and if you are at a computer, well, you probably are at a computer, or maybe you're looking from your phone and you want to cheat. Does anybody want to give me one accommodation idea? Give me one accommodation option that you can type in the chat box. And all you have to do is say what the limitation is and what the accommodation might be. So for Sonya, on days that it rains, Sonya really struggles with motion, especially with her back. So one of the accommodation ideas that I would have for my employer is, hey, I have a limitation on my movement, restricted movement, particularly when it rains outside. So I may ask my employer for a flexible leave schedule that on days where it is pretty bad, that maybe I might be able to take leave and and not be penalized for it. Allison,
in the chat, we're seeing schedule adjustments.
Yes.
And ramps.
Yes.
And adjustments for people who might be wheelchair bound.
Awesome.
I think Jonna might want to chime in.
Yes. I can't maneuver the chat box, so I have to speak. With rheumatoid arthritis, mornings are very difficult. So maybe the afternoon scheduling that you mentioned. I didn't even know that employers would be willing to do these things, and that flexible schedule thing you mentioned. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's shocking. I did not know. Didn't know that was available.
Yeah. So, in full disclosure, Ms. Jonna, I think that's excellent. You're right. You can have a scheduling adjustment is in fact an accommodation. So there are some things that now the question becomes this term called reasonable. So this is where the courts come in. They help us decide what's considered reasonable. So for Jonna, the limitation is that with rheumatoid arthritis, that maybe mornings are hard, so I need an afternoon schedule. And so if I have a business and I'm open from 8 to 4:30, and you are employed with me to work the front desk, now it may not be reasonable, or maybe I can split the job duties with someone else. So instead of that, maybe someone else comes in from 8 to noon, and then I take over from noon to 4:30. That may be an accommodation adjustment. Or if you have an employer that has 3 shifts, then maybe you get locked into the second shift, whether you have seniority or not. Like the reasonable accommodation, it is endless possibilities. Don't be afraid to ask. Now, whether or not that it's reasonable, it's up to the employer then to work with you. So it's a partnership between you and the employer. The employer saying, yes, we can do this, and it won't be disadvantageous to the business. And you saying, well, this will help me if you do. The issue comes between the tension of trying to balance accommodating employees and the impact that it has on the business. So that's why you want to make sure you have a conversation. That's a great example, Ms. Jonna. Are there any more, Ms. Allison, we need to talk about before I move on?
And this is all super encouraging. In the chat, we have ergonomic chair for back pain and the ergonomic keyboard for carpal tunnel.
I love it. Those are great accommodations. And you know what? They are actually, there's very few employers that would be able to say that that's not reasonable. Or that accommodating with an ergonomic keyboard or an ergonomic chair is going to break the bank. Very few employers could say that. So you're absolutely right. Those are accommodations in the workplace. And remember, it's covered by ADAAA. As long as you have the medical to support your need for that, they should provide that for you. All right, great work. Thank you. I love the participation. So then how do I request a reasonable accommodation? Now, remember, I told you that a lot of employers, these words cause them to shake in their boots because they may or may not have a lot of information about it. They know they have a liability and a responsibility, but they're really not sure a lot about it. So you're may have to take the position as educator to educate them. We always, here in our family, we say things like, sometimes you got to teach people how to do their job. And so when you request a reasonable accommodation, if they say, we don't do that here, You're going to remind them, oh, yes, we do. It's a federal responsibility. And as long as you have 50 or more employees, you are required to accommodate. So let me know when you would like to talk about it. So you may have to assist people in providing you the accommodation they need by educating them. So how do I request one? Well, it all depends on your employer, but you're going to, so I don't want to be specific because different employers have different processes. You would probably want to reach out to your human resource representative or your human resource specialist and ask them, do you have a reasonable accommodation process? If so, can you share that information with me? And then that way, when you're educated on the process, then you can make sure that they are following their process. So I think a lot of times as employees that will approach the conversation with, hey, I'm really struggling here. I'm not, I can't keep doing this. Like we're having a performance conversation. I'm struggling performing in my job because I've been sick. So we're having those conversations, but when you empower yourself with knowledge and ask them, do we have a reasonable accommodation process here? If so, can you share that with me so that you know what their processes are so that you can have your conversations and your documentation already lined up and you know where you're at in the process. It's a great place to gauge where we're at in the process. And keep in mind that these employers are on time limits for providing accommodations or providing reasons why they can't accommodate, but they at the very least have to work with you to find out what your limitations are, which job duties they're impacting negatively, and they have to explore accommodation options with you before they tell you no. So just know that. So you want to start with your supervisor or you want to start with your human resource professional in your organization. And some people are astute enough that they have someone that they have trained in reasonable accommodation. So, and we call those reasonable accommodation coordinators. So you may ask, do we have a particular reasonable accommodation coordinator here or a human resource specialist whose subject matter expertise is in reasonable accommodations. So you want to make sure you're talking to the right person right up front. And the reason why is because you don't want to share your medical with Jill, Sue, Ann, Mark, and Frank. Like you want to know who needs my medical, and that's where I expect it to stay. You don't want to be talking to the wrong person from the beginning and then sharing all this medical and they can't even help you and they pass you off to someone else. So make sure you're talking to the right person up front. So what should I expect after I request a reasonable accommodation, which I do recommend you always do it in writing. I know that we're kind and we live in a very kind society, but make sure you can ask verbally, but make sure you follow up in writing. Remember, your employer is on a schedule and they have to accommodate you. And so if you ever have to file a complaint, you want to make sure that you have written record of when the request was made, what the request was, and then also the time and date and how long it took to actually get the accommodation you needed. So your supervisor or human resource professional or your local reasonable accommodation coordinator, they should acknowledge your request timely. And I would ask them to acknowledge it in writing. Again, everything in writing, because if you have to file a complaint later, you need that in writing. Schedule an interactive meeting with you. So the first thing that they should do is schedule an interactive meeting with you to discuss your limitations and accommodation options. Remember the exercise we just did with askjan.org? That's a great place to start. And when you come to this interactive meeting, when you come educated and prepared to educate them if you need to, askjan.org is a great place to help you frame your conversation so that it's productive from the beginning. Now, remember, I'm not going to come into the conversation and talk about all of my medical ailments. I'm going to talk about the limitations I'm experiencing due to my medical ailments. I don't have to tell them right away what my diagnosis is, I do need to tell them what my limitations are and which job functions I'm struggling to perform because of those limitations. And I have already a list of accommodation options that may be helpful with me being able to do those things in the workplace. Now, when I say accommodation options, it's going to be important that, remember, I said it's an interactive meeting, that this is a contract between you and the employer. So remember that the employer has to be on board as well. That's why you want a list of accommodations that might help you. So sometimes one of the pitfalls in these interactive conversations is that one person, which is usually the employee, comes to the table and they want one accommodation and one accommodation only, and they expect you to provide it. But that doesn't show that we're trying to work together to find something that works. There's two things that an employer has to do. They have to help, they have to engage with you in a conversation about your limitations. And then two, they actually have to provide an accommodation that works. Well, who gets to decide whether the accommodation works? You get to decide. Is it working or is it not working? So if they provide you with accommodations maybe that weren't on your list, my recommendation, if you can, is consider trying them. And then after trying them, even though you knew it was never going to work from the beginning, because you know your body, you know your body's limitations, maybe you know right up front, this will never work. But I want to encourage you to consider trying it. And then sending them an email and telling them this is not working and here's why. So now you've shown that I'm trying to work with the employer. I'm just saying this isn't working. And remember, they have to provide you with an accommodation that works. So when you tell them it's not working, you want to do that in writing, and you want to tell them why it doesn't work. And then that way they have that in the writing. And then they should re-engage you in another interactive meeting to try to come up with a different accommodation option until the two of you can find one that works for both you and the employer. So that's the kind of information you're going to need going into this conversation. Because remember, they have to provide one that is effective. If it's not effective, tell them right away. Don't wait. Hey, I've been doing this for a week and it's not working. And here's why it's not working. I'm still experiencing these limitations, or I'm still not able to accomplish this duty. Now, does the employer have a right to request for medical information? The answer is yes. They have a right to ask that you verify that the medical limitations are in fact limiting, and to what extent they limit your activity. So, but here's the thing. They can't ask for too much medical or more than they need. And is there something in the chat box that I'm missing?
We're being asked if we can be provided with a copy of the presentation, which Sonya has already graciously agreed that we can make that available. So you will receive it in your email. Thank you, Sonya.
Awesome. You're very welcome. Thank you. So you may be asked to provide medical documentation, but here's the thing: you don't have to release medical records. What you can do is have your medical provider, you ask them, what information do you need from me? And then you ask your medical provider to type that up on letterhead, just the information they need from you. Resist the idea of going into your medical records and copying them, even though you may have them, and giving them to your employer. You do what you can to protect your medical information, but your employer also has a responsibility to protect your medical information. So I would, we'll talk about what medical and the limitations on that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So how can I best prepare for the interactive meeting to ensure that it's productive? I'm glad that you asked. The best way to prepare for an interactive meeting is to, number one, know your mental or physical limitations and have them listed. And be prepared to describe which job duties or duties are difficult for you to perform because of those limitations. So you're going to connect the dots for them. Here's my medical limitation, and then here are the job duties that are difficult for me to perform because of those limitations. You're also going to have a list of accommodation options that I would not share with them right off. Remember, you're engaging in an interactive conversation to try to come up with accommodations that will work for both of you. Your employer should at some point ask you, well, what can we do to help? And then that's when you're going to start talking about some of the accommodation options that you think might help you with these limitations, and be ready to explain how that helps you. The key is, like I spoke earlier, be open-minded about other options that your employer may throw out there, even if they're not on your list. But remember, they have to provide, their accommodation must be effective. So therefore, they, if it's not effective for you, try it out. You know, stay open, try it out. But if it's not effective, you tell them in writing, this accommodation is not effective and here's why. And then you guys should start the conversation about another accommodation option until you find one that does work for you. Be sure to provide feedback right away if the accommodation is or is not effective. And like I said, make sure that it's in writing. So one of the questions is, providing leave necessitated by an employee's disability a form of a reasonable accommodation? The answer is absolutely. Absent any undue hardship, providing unpaid leave for as a form of a reasonable accommodation, that is acceptable and an acceptable accommodation. Here's the limit. A couple of things that when it says undue hardship, so if you, depending on how much, what your job is, what your responsibilities are, and the impact of your absence on the organization, those are all things that would be taken in consideration when determined whether or not it's a hardship for the agency or for your employer, sorry. However, if you just need a day off here and there because of a particular limitation, your employer is going to have a hard time arguing it's an undue hardship. Inconvenience does not necessarily equal undue hardship. Now, if they can show every time this person's absent, we lose $4 million, now that they may make an argument for undue hardship. But really, accommodations can be really simple, really easy. And most times when we work together, we can find one that works for everybody. Now, as a reasonable accommodation, remember the purpose of a reasonable accommodation is for people who with disabilities or chronic illness to still be able to participate in the workplace. So everything is to keep you, to help you work in the workplace, in the job that you have. There are some scenarios when the employer cannot accommodate you, such as when earlier when we talked about the receptionist who could only work half shifts. Either they're going to have to give her half a part-time job working 8 to 4:30 because they're not open after 4:30, or they can look at opportunities to assign her to another position that is maybe not at the front desk and give her another job that is not a decrease in pay. Right? Not an increase in pay and not a decrease in pay, but another job at the same pay level that doesn't require someone at the front desk from the start, from the time they open to the time they close. So there's lots of things out there. Like I said, you're going to be the best educator because nobody knows your body better than you. Nobody knows your condition better than you and how it affects you. You just have to be effective in explaining to your employer how your medical limitations, how they are disrupting you at work, and then what they can do to help you minimize those disruptions. So is restructuring a job a reasonable accommodation? Absolutely. Like we talked about earlier with Ms. Jana, We can shift responsibilities. When we were talking about the filing system, somebody else who may not be wheelchair bound can file from A through P, and then I'll take over after that, because these are all files that are waist level and down. So just a little job modification would be a reasonable accommodation, or restructuring the job a bit, or altering how the task is performed. Those are all accommodations in the workplace. There are a plethora of them, but sometimes I think if you're not the person experiencing the limitation, it's very hard for people who don't have those limitations to wrap their brain around what's going on and how they might be able to help. So that's where you come in, and that's why these interactive conversations are required, because nobody knows you like you, and you help them understand, this is what it's doing to me in the workplace. This is what I need so that I can still be effective as someone who may not have these same limitations. So a few things that you should know about reasonable accommodation. Number one, employers with less than 15 employees are not covered under the ADAAA. So if you work for a very small business that has less than 15 employees, then ADAAA does not apply to them. That's important to know when you're out searching for jobs. The second thing is an employer can deny an accommodation if they can prove it's an undue hardship for the employer. So know that they do have the opportunity to deny any accommodation, but they have to prove, and it's that burden of proof is on the employer to prove it's an undue hardship. So if you hear the employer saying, I can't do that, I know that you want this accommodation, but I can't do that. I know you want a chair, but that chair you want is $150. I can't afford that. That's probably not going to fly with EEOC unless they can prove how $150 chair is going to break the bank for them. And I think they're going to have a hard time with that level of proof. Employers are not obligated to remove an essential function or modify a performance expectation. So here is where some things, the accommodation process has gone wrong for some people, just being honest, is that we can't ask someone else. So if we were hired for a position and there's a particular essential function of a duty that I'm supposed to perform, if I'm the operator who answers the telephones and I'm telling you I can't hear, my limitation is hearing, that's an essential function, right? They're not going to be able, unless they can find a system, which there are systems out there, and askjan.org is a great resource. There are systems that can, in fact, in real time, translate the conversation in writing so you could read it. So there are accommodations out there. Now, how much those systems cost and the size of the employer may come into play to determine whether or not that's an undue hardship. It may be easier or simpler, or maybe to move to a different position that doesn't require telecommunications. Or if you love your job and you want to stay in that position, then let's research some systems and some operational systems that may be viable for the employer to purchase so that you can stay in that job, even with a hearing limitation. The other thing an employer is not obligated to do is to lower a performance expectation. So I've had conversations with employees in the workplace who say that to be fully successful in this particular area of their job, they have to produce 10 widgets. So as a reasonable accommodation, they want theirs decreased to 5 widgets. I can tell you under reasonable accommodation that will never be reasonable to lower a performance expectation. What they do is say, okay, the standard is 10 widgets. What the conversation should be, what's keeping you, or what limitation are you experiencing where you can't reach the 10 widgets like everyone else on the team? And maybe it's something that maybe you're working on a production line and the production line moves too fast. And as in our earlier diagnoses that we found on Ask Jan, I have a grasping limitation. So I can't grasp that fast. And that's why I can't get all of them. I get every third widget, which is why I can't get to 10 like everybody else, because of this grasping problem I have, grasping limitation. Maybe we can ask them, can we slow down the line? As long as it's not an undue hardship on the agency. You know, if I slow down the line just a couple of notches and it costs the agency 400 extra bucks because they're producing less widgets, then that may be a reasonable accommodation. 400 bucks, I think you'll live. If it's costing them $4 million for every notch that they turn the line down, that may not fly when it comes to it. That may be an undue hardship on the agency. So it all depends on what you're doing and what you're working for, but just know they're not required to remove an essential function of your position. You have to do the essential functions of your job. Marginal functions, they can play with. But essential ones, you have to be able to do them. You tell them what you need to be able to do those essential functions. And then you can't expect them to modify the performance expectation. What you can help them do is understand what's keeping you from reaching the performance expectations and what they might be able to do to help you be able to reach it. So if an accommodation cannot be found, in other words, we, meaning the employer and the employee, cannot agree on an accommodation, and you're still not able to do the essential functions of the job that you were hired to do, with or without a reasonable accommodation, your employment can terminate. So your employer can terminate your employment, but it's only after they should have searched for accommodations that work. Like they should be able to show, here's all the things we've done to help them remain in their position in this place and perform to the expectation. But after all of these accommodations, they're still not able to perform, then they can terminate your employment. I wanted to be clear about that. So let's go back to test your knowledge. So who do I contact to request a reasonable accommodation? A, my supervisor. B, a human resources professional. C, the local reasonable accommodation coordinator. Or D, all of the above. Yes. Excellent.
I've got a couple of D's so far.
Yay. And your D's are right. Any one of these people should be able to assist you, or at the very least, point you in the right direction. Remember, you don't want to start sharing all your medical with the wrong person. Make sure you're talking to the right person who can help you through the entire process before you start even sharing medical. So here's the question of the day. How much medical information must I provide when requesting a reasonable accommodation? I'm really glad you asked. An employer may require an employee to provide documentation that is sufficient to substantiate that he or she has an ADA disability and needs an accommodation. But requests for medical documentation cannot be unrelated to your limitations or to the accommodation in which you're requesting. So what does that mean in plain English? That your employer can only ask for the minimal amount of information that helps them determine that you qualify as a person with a disability under the ADAAA. That's it. So that's why when they start asking for medical, what you need to ask them is, what do you need from me to help you determine whether or not I meet the criteria under the ADAAA and therefore must be provided with a reasonable accommodation. So when is enough enough? I love this question. Your documentation is sufficient if it describes the nature, severity and duration of the employee's impairment. If it describes what activity or activities that is limited, so what's my medical limitation, and what extent. So I can walk, so if I have a walking limitation, if I tell them, hey, I have a walking limitation, I can only walk for 10 feet at a time before I need to stop and rest. That is an impairment, a limitation, and it tells you the extent of my limitation. I can walk 10 feet or I can walk 1 mile. This is important for people who may work in like huge warehouses where they're having you, like Amazon or any other huge warehouse, Walmart, Dollar General, where they're having you, it sounds like, hey, go over there and get this, but over there may be a mile to, you know, the other side of the warehouse. So if you're struggling in those scenarios, just making sure that your medical provider identifies how far you can walk. And how long it might take you. If it's routine and regular for you to walk a mile, then this is how much time they need to give you to do that, because you have to stop and rest at every half mile or every 10 feet or whatever. So that would be sufficient as long as it tells the extent of your impairment. And when your medical provider substantiates why you need the accommodation requested. This is considered sufficient documentation by EEOC. The nature and severity and the duration of the employee's impairment. Now, when we say duration, it's because employees are not required to accommodate transient issues. So they're not required to accommodate common colds. We know that a common cold lasts 3 to 5 days, maybe 7 days, and then you move on. So a common cold will not qualify under ADAAA. So that's where the duration comes in. So a nature, the severity, and the duration. Notice that none of this says, what's your diagnosis? I never have to share my diagnosis, just my impairment or my limitations, to the extent which activity is limited by them, and what job duties you're struggling to perform with those limitations.
Sonya, I think we had a hand. Jonna, did you have a question?
She actually just answered it because I was going, oh, hold on. She actually just answered it because I was going to ask, do you ever have to tell them what your actual diagnosis is? So that's, to me, that's too much information. So you just covered that. So thank you.
Yeah, and just so you know, sometimes telling people, I'm happy to help, Ms. Jonna, thank you. Sometimes telling people your diagnosis actually it doesn't help them help you, because then everybody becomes, you know, Google medical provider, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that's what, remember, we're trying to help them help us be viable contributors to the work environment. We want to work, help us continue to work. I want to do my job. I love my job. Unfortunately, I have limitations that you may or may not experience yourself. And so I'm going to help you understand what those limitations, the impact of them on me, and then how it impacts me in the workplace. So we can come up together with an idea on how we can help mitigate those limitations. And
I'm sorry. I did have a question. When you were talking earlier about talking to the right person about your issue before you tell everything, how do you, what are the words that you would use when you're asking, say, your supervisor, because they're probably not going to be the people to help you, but how would you ask them, who do I go to see? What would be the words that you use?
Yeah, excellent.
Who are you asking?
Yeah, excellent question, Jonna. So if I would start with my supervisor, because that's the person you probably have the most contact with. And I would just say, hey, supervisor, can you tell me who is responsible for the reasonable accommodation program here at my workplace? And they're probably going to look at you like, what?
That makes sense, though.
Yeah. You just ask them, who is the person responsible for reasonable accommodations? Or you can ask them, who's the person responsible for accommodate employees with disabilities in the workplace?
Okay.
Yeah. And that's an easy, innocent question, right?
Mm-hmm.
I may be asking for myself. I might be asking for somebody else. You don't know who I'm asking for. I'm just wondering.
Mm-hmm.
But is information that should be available to anybody who asks. And it should be readily available for anybody who asks. So that's how I would start the conversation. And if I don't know where to go, I would start it with my supervisor. Now, if my supervisor is not helpful and says, I don't know, which shouldn't be the supervisor response, but we all know that people function at different levels. If your supervisor's response is, I don't know, and not, I don't know, but let me find out, then my next conversation is going to be with the human resources.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So let's test our knowledge right here. What do I do if my employer asks for additional medical documentation beyond what you know to be needed to accommodate you? Well, A, I'm going to consider helping them understand how the medical provided meets the standards as required by ADA. B, I'm going to ask my employer to explain why the documentation is insufficient and request they allow you an opportunity to provide the missing information in a timely manner. C, consider filing a complaint with EEOC. Or D, any one or all of the above. What's your answer?
Watching the chat. So far, I have 2 Ds.
Awesome. You are absolutely right. And let me just tell you, it all depends on, the tone and the attitude in the workplace, to be honest. A, sometimes people just don't know and you just have to help them. And if you're feeling very gracious that day, you can just help them understand, hey, I'm sorry, I do appreciate your request. I call this the Allison Method. She's very kind. And she's teaching me how to be kinder by leading by example. So A is going to be the Allison response. I'm sorry. I'm confident that the information I've already provided you is consistent and meets the standards required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Can you relook at that and make see if you're make another assessment to determine if it's enough? So that's the nice Allison response. You're just telling them, oh no, you've got enough. Just look at it one more time and let me know if you still need anything. B, you can ask your employer to explain why the documentation you have is not sufficient. That's a reasonable question. So if I'm going to Allison and I say, hey, Miss Allison, I'm looking at your medical here and I still don't even know if you qualify under ADAAA, and this is quite an extensive list of accommodations that's going to cost, me greatly. So what I need from you is I need evidence that you even meet the definition of disability. Allison's response to me should be, okay, can you tell me exactly what it is you need from me that you don't already have in your possession? And then I will look it over to determine whether or not it's required by the ADAAA. I hope you're feeling empowered in these conversations.
And again, it helps to get these conversations in writing or documented somehow.
Absolutely. And I love having verbal conversations just because I'm not a person who hides behind email. So I'll have a verbal conversation, but I will always go back to my email and follow up. Always. Hey, it was great talking with you today. I just want to make sure that we're both on the same page, that I told you this and you needed this from me and I plan to provide it by this date, or that the conversation was the information you had for me was sufficient according to ADAAA. However, you requested additional documentation. Can you let me know if this is correct? Any way to document the conversation. And then also you can go directly to EEOC and file a complaint if you feel like your employer is asking for information beyond what's necessary to provide the accommodation that you've needed. And thank you for hanging in there. We're almost done. So there are common medical documentation pitfalls we want to avoid. These are things that are considered insufficient by the EEOC. If your medical documentation does not specify the existence of a disability and explain the need for accommodation, it is considered inefficient. So again, this is not necessarily a diagnosis. It's just saying if your documentation doesn't say that you have an ADA disability, in other words, your medical provider can say, you know, Sonja Robertson has a disability covered by the ADAAA that will meet that expectation, and she needs a reasonable accommodation. That's how the paragraph can start. Documentation is insufficient if the healthcare professional does not have the expertise to give an opinion about the employee's medical condition and its limitations. For example, if you have a chiropractor that's commenting on your mental stability, obviously, if there are mental impairments, your chiropractor is beyond their scope of practice to be the person writing the documentation for you. So your employer can actually reject it if the medical provider is operating outside of their scope of practice. The documentation is insufficient if it does not specify your limitations. Remember, we talked about the limitations. So you're going to want to make sure your provider has that information in there. And then it's insufficient if it indicates the information provided is not credible or fraudulent. So this is really easy for most people. We always just say, make sure your medical provider has it on letterhead. We've seen medical information that's come in that's obviously been altered. It's been altered. And so those are that the agency or the employer can say that this is insufficient because it appears not credible on its face. So if an employee provides insufficient medical documentation, just remember the employer is not required to provide the accommodation until they receive sufficient medical documentation. Now, before I move forward with FMLA, which is really going to be quick and easy, does anybody have any questions about the ADAAA, the governing body of the EEOC or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commissions, and how they can prepare for a reasonable accommodation interactive meeting to help their employer understand what you need in the workplace and put them in position to get it for you? Great. All right, so let's talk about the Family and Medical Leave Act, or most affectionately known as FMLA. Now, FMLA is different from the ADAAA in the fact that it is enforced by the Department of Labor. So if you have a claim that your employer is violating your rights under FMLA or the Family and Medical Leave Act, you would contact the Department of Labor, and that website is at the bottom. It's just dol.gov. Full disclosure, all of this information I took directly from the DOL's website so that I didn't give you the federal government response. I have given you that's what's expected from the Department of Labor from all employers who qualify under this act. So remember, FMLA is an entitlement. In other words, if you meet the criteria, so you have a serious health condition, then if you have a serious health condition, then you have an entitlement to this particular act. So FMLA entitles eligible employees, that's employees that have been covered on the job for at least 1 year, So you have to be with your employer for a year before they're required, before you would be considered eligible under FMLA. So FMLA entitles eligible employees covered to take unpaid job protected leave for specified family and medical reasons with a continuation of your health insurance coverage and this under the same terms and the conditions as if the employee had not taken leave. So what FMLA does, it allows you leave without pay, but you can come back after 12 weeks to your position, the same position or one comparable, and they can't impact, does not impact your insurance. So if your job provides health insurance, then that coverage is continued throughout the FMLA period. Now remember, FMLA only applies to employers that meet certain criteria. So in the private sector, in order for the Department of Labor to determine that that employer is in fact entitled to administer FMLA to their employees, they have to have 50 or more employees. So 50 or more employees, then they are in fact, they have to affect this entitlement for their employees. Any public agency, whether local, state, or federal government, they are covered. They have to provide FMLA to their employees, no matter how many are in the office. And it also applies to public and private elementary and secondary schools, regardless of the number of employees. So these are the people who are covered. Employers that have 50 or more employees, any public agency like local, state, or federal government, and any private or public schools, elementary or secondary schools. So who's an eligible employee? If my employer is eligible and required to affect FMLA, then how do I know as an employee if I'm eligible? Well, if you worked for the employer, so in other words, you have to be employed by them, obviously, that you've worked for them for at least 12 months, and there's a minimum number of hours. So what if I don't work 8 hours a day or I don't work the full week? Well, now they have, if you've completed 1,250 hours of service, you would be considered eligible with that employer. And the employer, of course, has to have at least 50 employees within 75 miles of the central office. So then if you meet this criteria, then FMLA is in fact extended to you. So the FMLA entitlement itself is just a qualified employee who's worked for the employer for at least a 12-month period, that they have 12 work weeks, up to 480 hours, if you were counting hours, to care for the employee's spouse, to care for the employee's child, or the parent of who has a serious health condition. So it can be for your serious health condition, or you can use FMLA to care for a family member, a qualifying family member with a serious health condition. Now, when I say child, you have to know that the child has to be under 18 years of age, or if the child is 18 years of age or older, but is unable to care for themselves, such as, maybe there is a diagnosis that they would always have to be supervised. And there's several diagnoses that allow that when they know they've deemed that your 18 or older child cannot care for themselves, but requires oversight, and you have actually court documentation that you care for that child, even though they're beyond 18 and older, then you too can use that court documentation to show that they're eligible, even though they're 18 years of age or older. So remember, FMLA is an entitlement that protects your job and your health care for up to 12 work weeks or 480 hours in any 12-month period. So your FMLA entitlement lasts for 12 months. And so if I use January, February, and March, I had a family member, a qualifying family member who had COVID, and I took off to care for them because of their limitations. Now, if I took the time off in January, February, and March, that's 12 weeks or 480 hours. I'm not going to be eligible to use FMLA again until the next calendar year. So FMLA renews every calendar year. Sorry. Not sure how to get it back. There we go. Okay. And there are other eligible circumstances that are not listed here. This is not the full measure of the FMLA entitlement. I did specifically pull these two things because we're talking about living chronic faith in our workplaces. So there are other reasons why people can use FMLA that are not included in this slide. Okay, so just remember, if you leave, the job protections that you have for FMLA is if you're gone for 12 weeks, this can be continual or intermittent. So in other words, if I need to take my whole 12 weeks in one chunk, then I'm not going to be eligible for FMLA again until the next year. But if I take intermittent leave, in other words, maybe I go to dialysis, twice a week. So I just need FMLA to go to my dialysis appointments on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I can do that intermittently. I just take FMLA leave on Tuesday for my dialysis appointment and Thursday for my dialysis appointment, and I do that up until I've reached the 480-hour limit in that calendar year. So just know that it protects your job and all the benefits associated with your job for that 12 work week period. As I mentioned earlier, it does protect your group health insurance as well if your employer offers health insurance. And then here's some other benefits and an employee's rights to benefits other than group health insurance while on FMLA. It depends on the employer's policy. So in other words, any benefit that would be maintained while the employee is on other leave, including accrued leave. So if I'm gone and I accrue leave, then you should be able to do that as well, even though you're on FMLA leave. All your benefits should be protected. So even though FMLA on its face is leave without pay, which means you don't have a paycheck, the whole point is the job protections and the health insurance coverage and all other benefits stay in place for that 12 work week period. So even though you may have that FMLA is leave without pay, you can substitute any accrued paid leave. So in other words, yes, I need to be off from January, February, and March because of my family member that has COVID. But I can't afford to be without a paycheck for those three for that 12 work week period. Therefore, I'm going to use my annual leave or my sick leave that I have accrued so that I get a paycheck. So just understand that when you do that, you're using two leave entitlements at the same time. You're using paid leave, which should be available to you anyway if the circumstances warrant it. I should be able to use any accrued sick leave according to my agency's policies or my employer's policies to care for my sick loved one. But if for some reason they're not allowing me to do that for whatever reason, then I know I may need to file FMLA, but I'll be using both my accrued leave entitlement and my leave without pay entitlement all at the same time. And if I need to explain that a little bit more in detail, I can talk about that a little bit later. So how do I request FMLA? Well, if it's you if you're requesting FMLA for your medical condition, then you would fill out the WH380E form. E stands for employee, and you can Google this form. You can ask your supervisor for it, or you can Google it. I prefer to Google it because then it's available to me when I need it, and I can fill it in online as necessary and get it to my provider right away. If you're caring for a qualifying family member, then you would fill out the WH380F form, and the F just stands for family member. So just make sure you're filling out the correct form, because the questions are a little bit, well, you're going to fill out the first part. Your medical provider is going to fill out most of it, but they ask different questions, whether it's you asking for FMLA for your medical conditions or whether it's your family member that you're requesting to use FMLA to assist them. And these are all on the Department of Labor website, or just Google it and it'll come up for you. Now I've reached the end of my presentation. It is now 2:26, so thank you for your patience and time. I want to turn it back over to Allison to help me moderate any questions you might have about any of the information I shared or anything else that of how I might be able to assist you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. What an amazing, amazing presentation. As always, you deliver. So everyone, if you would do me a favor, if you enjoyed this presentation, would you just put a heart up really quickly for our speaker, just to show her appreciation. And at this point, if you have questions, thank you so much. I see hearts going up everywhere. If you would just either get my attention, unmute, or put your questions in the chat, and we will go forward. Let's do this real quickly, though, so that anyone that needs to go can do so. Sonya has so graciously agreed to pray over us before we go. And so we want to make sure that everybody gets covered by the prayer. So if you would go ahead and pray, and then we'll take questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Great idea. God, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for who you are. God, that our hope is in you, our trust is in you, that everything we are, we know is in you. And because we have you, then we lack no good thing. So thank you for who you are and who you are in our lives. God, I thank you for my journey. And God, even though mine was a quick fix, we know, Father, that we have brothers and sisters all across this world who are journeying to their healing. So we just want to stop right here and invite you into this conversation yet again, as we have so many times before. God, that we know that you are a miracle worker. And if that you're looking to and from the earth to look for someone to show yourself strong, God, here we are. Work a miracle in our lives. We invite you that the world may see and hear and know that you are God, because you delight in showing yourself to us. God, and your strength and your power and your might is uncontended. So we just pray right now, God, if you're looking for someone, God, in which you can show yourself strong, we're making ourselves available to you. We invite your miracle working power, God, to change the trajectory of our lives. But we also know, God, that you are interested, God, in the purposes and the plans you have for each one of us. And God, that whether we have an instantaneous healing or whether we're journeying to our healing, we know that you're with us and that you're for us. And so, God, we just say in the name of Jesus, God, give us wisdom and instruction and insight. God, teach us, God, how we can be good stewards over the bodies you've given us, over the minds you've given us, God, to see to it that your purposes prevail in us and through us, God, that the world may know who you are. I pray, God, for my brothers and sisters who may just be tired from the journey. I just speak life into them right now, God, fresh wind and fresh fire, God, that would just enthuse and ignite them, Father, to a new way, God, to new understanding, seeing you at work in their life day in and day out, God, providing them all that they need, God, for life and for godliness, God. And I pray, Father, in the name of Jesus, God, that whatever purposes you have for us, God, that we would fulfill them, God, with or without an accommodation. We just say, you're welcome into our lives. We love you. We thank you. We appreciate you. God, dispatch medical providers and scientists, God, to be able to, God, just come up with new revelation and understanding, Father, that we could conquer all of these sickness and disease, God, under your name. But more than anything, it's the blood of Jesus, God, that heals us. It was your stripes that bore the weight and the pain. So, God, we just say in Jesus' name, we receive you. We receive you. We receive you and all that you are, God. God, give us strength and wisdom.